All right, everybody. This is your Tracklandia USATF Marathon Championships and CIM preview. I'm going to look into the camera. I'm also talking to my good friend Geoff Burns, who's joining me for this. Geoff is a PhD in kinesiology and exercise sciences. I'm going to read through your whole bio here. Master in biomechanical and biomedical engineering. Is that true?
Say biomedical engineering. Yeah.
What's the difference between the two of those?
Say biomechanics is a subset within. And so, yeah, you can concentrate in that. But biomedical, more broad.
Okay.
So
I'll believe it. Sounds believable. Now you're a physiologist for Team USA in Colorado Springs and US 100K champion, I believe, 5th in the world at a time.
Yes.
And a 224 marathoner. This is the preview show for CIM, and we will also be doing a post show from the ground, boots on the ground in Sacramento on December 4th. So be sure to check that out as well. But right now we're going to go over the course preview, what is won in the past on this course and in this particular race, and the contenders for the Marathon Championships coming up in December. So I just want to start out by saying that I love CIM, and I'm from the Sacramento area, so it's a hometown race for me of sorts. But I think it's one of the best run races in the country. The organization is super dialed, and they take care of all the details. They're super hospitable there. I want to give a big shout out to Danielle Dominicelli, who's the elite coordinator and just looks after everybody's needs. She's on top of it. I don't think she sleeps at all through November leading up to this race. So December 5th, she's going to be a very exhausted but happy woman. And nobody takes more joy in seeing the results of the masses in this race than she does. But I think the feel of this race is it's like going home for the holidays and running a marathon. It's just that welcoming. What do you say?
I agree. I mean, I think this race is awesome and beautiful in so many ways from the standpoint of being essentially it's this like a tractor beam, like gravitational hole of people chasing fast times and chasing dreams. But no, seriously, it just has a culture around it of people running fast, but also racing. And I think there's always been a special place in my heart for point-to-point races from the standpoint of, it's like a journey. I mean, that's what, the Boston Marathon, one of our original, long distance foot races in the world, was, say the original marathon was that. And so I think there's just this like, kind of like deep, like almost like visceral appeal and just natural, like beauty of a foot race covering a distance, like a point to point distance as a journey.
I agree.
And so I think
the starting line is its own landmark and the finish line is its own landmark, and you have different feelings that are attached to each of those things, and there's a whole odyssey in between them that you go through.
It is an odyssey. I think that's it perfectly. And I think you get CIM specifically because people know Stanford on the track. You go to Stanford to run fast because it's always perfect weather. And CIM, the marathon, is such a fickle race in that it is so contingent. Like the smallest deviations from perfect weather can cause big ripple effects in the race. And so CIM, because of where it falls on the calendar and it's beautiful, mid-Californian climate is just, it's predictably a good chance to test your fitness. And so what ends up happening is it just becomes this like ecosystem. And like there are so many examples in sport of like culture being a force multiplier of something, in the sense of like, you get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, good people together running fast. It's not 1 + 2 + 3 + 4. They multiply. And you see that at CIM. So it really is this, it's just a beautiful foot race. And I think, and what, and it's what we'll be talking about today, but it really it sets itself up to be a good race as well. And that's something that we don't see very much in America, in the sense of like American, like a showcase of our country's, top racers racing each other, and a depth to that, where so often in the majors, we don't really get to see, our country's own play out and do battle against each other, because you have the elite fields, and oftentimes, obviously, they're going to be like international, and the depth, the disparity is pretty large. So I think this is just a really good showcase of where, what's going on in our country, the state of the nation in terms of marathon running. So it's
That's a good way to put it. And some might say that it's the most marathon in the US too, because of all of these compounding factors. You have the masses showing up, and a point-to-point race that is traditional of the marathon. The original marathon was that way, and Central California being a Mediterranean climate, this is the type of weather that the ancients ran in December, probably in Greece. So a lot of feelings, a lot of emotions swirling around on the day on December 4th. But I think you definitely hit on it, and that's the story around this. In my mind, there are two major storylines for CIM. There's the race up front, and specifically this year because we'll be crowning 2 U.S. champions in the marathon. But then there's also the Olympic trials qualifier race, and it's this race in the past, I would say, the past Olympic cycle has been an OTQ factory. Just to go through some numbers here, for the 2020 Olympic trials cycle here, for women qualifiers for the Olympic trials in Atlanta, 180 of them came from CIM. From New York City, Chicago, and Boston combined, 84. For men, CIM, 102 men came from CIM, and from Chicago, New York City, and Boston combined, 39. Those are staggering numbers, and it's ridiculous too. You touched on it. You touched on it when you were talking, but like I've heard, and this stuck out to me last year when we were there. Somebody commented that there is far more vomit at the finish line at CIM than any other marathon that they've been to. And I think that's a testament to the depth, because in a lot of other major marathons, the majors around the world, you have the tip of the spear, the top athletes that are pushing it. And granted, they probably puke at the finish. But then you have a lot of like recreational runners who aren't, they're trying to hit times, but they're not going to that red line as much as everybody else. So that kind of big chunk right behind the tip of the spear, I guess you could say where the spear fans out, is much more present in Sacramento than it is anywhere else.
Absolutely. I think that the depth in a race and competitive parity, how's that? I think has just that synergistic effect that evokes one to empty the tank further than they otherwise would, and literally and figuratively, perhaps. And yeah, you see that at the finish line for sure.
And I've heard from runners in the pack too that it's just an incredible feeling running at 2:17 pace or 2:40 pace in a pack of 50 to nearly 100 people, and the feeling around it is just sharing water bottles and just like you see this rolling pack that I don't think you see that very many other places around the world, where the sun is shining off of everybody's Oakleys or whatever shades they're wearing, the spit coming off of their faces, and it's just a magical thing. But can you describe your experience in the pack, because you've run this?
Yeah. And I mean, it's it is that, in the sense that it's such a unique race in that depth at that band of what you might call internationally sub-elite, but very, very high level running. And it's that idea that having runners around you, I think there's a lot of reasons for this. I think you could say mechanical, physiological, psychological. Having individuals around you helps you run faster. From the base, very simple idea of, if you can have wind broken for you, that can be minutes in a marathon. Or the idea of essentially just not having the psychological, what's the right word? Like the psychological tax or cost of having to continually drive and maintain a speed, and essentially being able to outsource that control to those around you. I think that saves that, I would hypothesize that could lend itself to more efficient running, but also allow you to potentially, whether it's preserve your stress hormones or adrenal hormones or something, to allow you to, better titrate that effort, when it matters in a race. But then also just having that kind of like psychological normalization of what you're doing in the moment. So whatever speed that you're running at, having 15 other people around you running at that same speed, like that is an affirmation that is a doable thing. There's less of an out in your mind to slow down or stop. So it really, it creates that. I think the thing is, it's just so synergistic when you have more people running fast together, and it doesn't exist really anywhere else in America. And I think maybe even in the rest of the world, this phenomenon you actually see happen in Japan, probably more commonly in road races, half marathons or even marathons, where you have a really big depth of people right around certain bands of time. So if they have a lot of guys right around 2:10 or 2:12, or in the half marathon, 62 minutes or something, you just have this groundswell, this momentum that carries. And so I think this is kind of our, existence of that. And so thinking back, to my experience running this versus, I think the best way to contrast it is, this versus like one of the majors where you rattled off those stats of how many people qualify for this. One of the things that struck me about running this race is you really have a lot of fan and crowd support the whole way. It's not like it's like wall to wall 5 deep the entire route, but really almost the whole way you have people along the road making noise for you. So you have the external energy coming in, but then you have that just like pretty crazy feeling of momentum. It's like you're caught in a river almost of runners at a given speed. And you get these kind of like, almost like localized pods of groups, like, one group running 2:22 pace, one group running 2:18 pace, one group running 2:17 pace. And it's like these little like bubbles form, and they're buses really that's what they call like pace groups in the Comrades Marathon, one that I've run before. They call them buses. So it's like the 2:15 bus, but that's literally what they are, is these like pods of runners that you kind of like jump in and just roll with. And there's a lot of them along the way. But what's interesting is I think what's so unique too about CIM is then at no point in the race are you really ever lonely. And that's a defining feature of a lot of marathons and a lot of city marathons, in that you hit long stretches where you might be isolated and not have competitors, and you might not have crowd support. And in a marathon, especially in the back half of the race where the effort is really raised and you're just, the demons in your head are kind of like talking louder and louder and like slowing down, and momentum is moving against you. And in those points where you're isolated, it becomes very easy to lose the thread of the race. And in the marathon, when you lose the thread, that is like the speed or the goal that you're going for, a lot of times it's somewhat catastrophic, and you can lose 30 seconds over several miles, or a minute over a, you know, a 5K or 10K segment. And you really can kind of like hemorrhage time if you lose focus. And so CIM has this like interaction of external crowds, but then the internal like buses that drive you to not lose that thread and not kind of like hemorrhage that time that might come from a lack of focus. And I think one of the really interesting contrasts in that is against like some of the major marathons. I was out at the Chicago Marathon last year, and I was all over the course, and I was blown away at how many spots and in that race were completely empty of like fans, competitors, anything. It was like the whole city was shut down, so there weren't even cars. It was just this like long, empty stretches. And that's really, really hard to run fast in when you're running, especially if you're isolated and not racing somebody. And usually at the end of a marathon, like that's at the point in the last like 10K of a race when you're not really running. You might not be in those buses start to splinter and everybody's going to start running their own paces. And when you're isolated like that in the back half of a race, it can become very easy to not hit, you know, times. Because one of the tricky things about running too is when you're chasing a time, and, you know, like you were saying, the OTQ factory, a lot of these people just chasing that time. If you don't have an external cue that is like a competitor or something holding you accountable, like a race, like that time, like that, you know, that your mind can quickly figure out ways to rationalize not hitting that. And it becomes very difficult if you're alone. And so I think CIM is just unique in that you have that internal and external energy playing off each other to cue and keep the runners on task.
Those are all really good points, and I like that you use the river analogy too when talking about this race, because that is kind of what it seems like when you see this flow of runners going down Fair Oaks Boulevard, and then Sacramento being a river town too. You got the confluence of the American and Sacramento right there.
Maybe, I was going to say, it's like, yeah, the American River.
We should call them boats, not buses, for this marathon.
I like that. Boats.
Lifeboats. Yeah. Climb into the lifeboat.
I think that's going to happen. We're going to now from henceforth refer to this as, this is the OTQ boat. This is the 217 boat.
Yeah. Well, the standards we all know now have shifted from 2020. So the men dropped from 219 down to 218 for the American folks in this race, and the women whopping 245 down to 237. So just had 8 minutes sliced off of that OTQ there. With that window, the window open now, and so many runners, I think we've seen that. I want to say that there's at least 100 on each side, on the men's and women's side, that are within striking distance of these times, which is absolutely ridiculous. But what would be your over-under for how many we'll get this year at CIM?
Oh, that's a good question. Over-under. I would say like 2018 and 2019 would probably be our best like cues off of that. You know, the data scientist in me like would want to go back and look at historical trends.
Yeah, but pretend you're a gambling man for just a second, not a data scientist.
I'm not a gambling man. I'm a scientist.
You make educated guesses.
Yeah, educated guesses. I gotta think like, I think there's going to be more for the men this year than the women. How's that? So that's starting point.
That's a shift.
And I think there's going to be on the order of 30 for the men. Okay. And 25 for the women.
All right. Those are your odds right there. So what are we giving there? Yeah. You can take that. That's even right there. So What'd you say? 30 for the men, 25 for the women.
Yeah.
Yeah, the lines have been set by Geoff Burns here. Yeah, let's dig into this course profile a little bit and see kind of we've got a graphic here that we can throw up on the screen, and I've pulled this stuff from Strava here, so I wanted to shift the map here to show to have it match up with the elevation profile. So we flipped it upside down. Yeah, you can take a look at there. It is a net downhill course for CIM, and that's been talked about a lot on message boards. But there are some hills at the beginning, and it might not look like it from this map here, but those hills can get to you a little bit early on, and there is a not a net elevation gain, but an elevation gain of 969 feet here throughout this course, but a net downhill of 340 feet. So what would you say, like, as you look at this course, what's the ideal way for the average marathoner, average elite marathoner, if that makes sense? Because everybody's got different skill sets and specializations. Some people might want to attack the hills, or maybe nobody. You're the expert here. Maybe nobody should attack the hills. But how should somebody look at this course and say, "This, I'm going to race it strategically this way"?
Yes. So rule number one, unless you're standing on Giro, you do not attack anything at the start of a marathon. But yeah, so this is what's interesting about this course is it is hillier than it has the reputation of being this net downhill course that everybody runs super fast. I would say from my personal experience running it, but best assessment and analysis of running it, it is a tiny bit. It is a little bit faster than a flat course. But I think the reason for that is because of what the back half of it looks like versus the first half. When I ran it for the first time, I was very, very surprised at how like rolling the first half of the race felt. Like it is certainly a net downhill, but there's just so many points where you have an uphill, and in running, like uphills cost more than downhills give back, if that makes sense. So if running up a certain gradient might, cost you 2 or 3% extra energy, you might running down it, you might only gain, 1 or 2%. So it's, when you have a rolling, that's why a rolling course is obviously going to be slower than a flat course. But so I think for this race, yeah, you certainly don't attack it. And I think and maybe this will kind of get into how the race plays out. The race asks you to attack it, though. Like that's one of the defining features of the course is the first 10 kilometers. Like I would say the first 5-ish K are, net certainly rolling, but you have a couple long downhills that can really get you going. And in a marathon, it's so dangerous because like you've trained forever and ever and ever for this race, and you're tapered and you have the adrenaline and you start the race. And if you start a marathon right, it should feel like torturously easy running at the speed that you should be running at. And so it just lends itself to going out a little bit faster in a normal marathon. And, it requires that level of caution. CIM kind of throws gasoline on that because you have these long downhills at the start. And then the stretch from like 5K to 10K, so like 3 to 6 miles there, is there's really no uphill. It's pretty much consistently downhill. And so you can really blast that first bit of that, or like get in over your head. And why I think that's interesting is it definitely can give the opportunity for people to make bold moves and, blow a race open early. But the flip side of that is if you have some level of like governance among it. So along our boats that are going, if you have people who are like, I'm running 5:17 pace, or I'm running 5:16 pace, no faster for whatever, that you can have all of these people that want to run so much faster, but they're like stuck in this pace boat that they know they should be in, and it kind of bottles up the energy. So it's actually a very positive thing for the back half of the race. So it's very unique that if you were to run it on your own, you'd be so tempted to run super fast at the start. And I think at the very pointy end of the race, that could happen. And maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit. But for those pace groups, you'll have some people that will want to run faster, but will be in a given pace group and not do it and kind of bottle up that energy, I think, in a very positive way. But then you also might have some people that go out like way too hard in that spot and try and like take their chance, and they'll pay for it later. So that's the first 10K is very quick. I would say the next 10K, like through half, basically, thinking like 6-7 miles through the halfway point, that's where it's like surprisingly rolling, where you kind of like, you can blast that first 10K and then you get rollers. It again is a very slight net downhill, but it's probably almost even, that segment, but it has up and down. And if I remember correctly, I don't think I ever felt like I was running on flat ground during that. It was always going a little up or a little down. And that's again where it's really helpful to have other runners around you to key off of, because that can really sap momentum, or require a lot of external energy or mental energy to kind of, stay on it. Whereas if you can, again, outsource that psychological burden to those around you, it's less affecting. But yeah, so the first part of this race, I think it invites you to run harder than you should, and rewards you if you don't, looking at the back end. But yes, it's a very, very unique start.
It seems like if you thread the needle correctly, the cards can play for you. But if
it's almost like I think it's the, it's the snake offering the shiny red apple. Yeah. It's like you have these downhills, and it's like, again, in so many other marathons, I think that that would just blow people up. And you might even get that in the masses too, of people just running too fast there. And it's like, it feels so easy, because you're fresh and you've got these long downhill stretches. And it's like, if you have the self-discipline to say, no, snake, I will not take the apple today. I'm going to eat me at, mile 20 or 20. Yeah, you can pay dividends. It's a good investment, but it definitely is a tempting geography.
And that we're just going to show briefly too, the comparison to the other famous point-to-point marathon in the country, Boston, which the elevation gain is similar. I mean, Boston, probably a third more there, but yeah, the net downhill pretty similar as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, these point-to-point races, they have their. I like how there are these chapters involved to them too, and like a circular or a roundabout race too. It does as well, but yeah, they're even more unique. They're their own beasts here, because you don't have to end up at the same location.
I can't agree more. And that's why, I referenced it earlier, but my favorite race on the planet is the Comrades Marathon in South Africa. And it's famous for being point to point. And the fact that it is point, and it actually changes directions every year for your listeners and viewers that to like further magnify the point to pointishness. But that, to your point, it gives it character. Like that's the reason that race is so popular. It's the reason Boston is so popular. And I think it's one of the reasons why CIM is so popular, is because you have these chapters to the race that are distinct stories and that don't, that are, again, it's that idea of there's a narrative to it. It's a journey, it's a story, the race. And I don't think you get that in other races that are just kind of, some sort of circuit or something like that. And the interesting thing with this downhill and versus Boston, you see the same phenomenon happen at Boston too, where people go out way too hard and pay for it on the back end. But I think there's a couple of interesting differences between those. The first is that in Boston, you don't have the level of, again, one of the defining features at the front end of CIM, or at least that kind of like big, say that like, OTQ pursuit of people trying to hit fast time, a certain time. You don't have that level of control at Boston. So like you have people just going out hoping they have a good day and they pay for it on the back end much more. The other thing that I think is a defining difference between these two courses, and it's probably the reason why CIM is so much faster and one of the reasons why Boston, challenges some people, is the second half. And the fact that like CIM has a lot of very small, again, these like rolling hills through the course of especially the first half, that no one of them is really that large, but it's just a lot over the course of it. Whereas like Boston, the back half of the race, you have some very substantial uphills, like the Newton Hills, it's 4 or 5 hills that are basically momentum sappers. Whereas CIM, you get that largely out of the way in the first half. And so the back half of the race is this very gentle, consistent, like downhill that is, and the reason why this is so important and defining in what it means for the times and performances in the race is those are two very different profiles that happen at the point in the race where the effect of either of them is just exponential. Like it's multiplied by itself over and over, in the sense that like the hills of Boston, if they were to happen at the beginning, would not slow people down nearly enough. And it's not just because you're tired at the end of the race or like you have less of an ability to deal with it. And then in CIM, like not only do you not have that, you have a gentle downhill. It's the point in the race where any sort of momentum, positive or negative, again, is exponentially multiplied. And that idea of like the marathon has all of these different basically opportunities for you to hemorrhage time. Mm-hmm. And so in Boston, if you hit those hills and you're just you burned them like just one more match than you should have, it can really just take all the wind out of your sail. And again, you just lose large chunks of time because you lose the thread of the story. I mean, maybe you meet a new character in the story that you weren't expecting to meet. But no, you kind of lose that focus, both, consciously, but also subconsciously. You kind of lose the thread of what you're doing, where CIM is the exact opposite, where you get to that back half of the race and like the hard, those rolling sections are over. And so at the point when your body is most fragile and your mind is most fragile and you're susceptible to like, crosswinds doing you wrong, you don't have those beasts. And so you can kind of use all of your faculties to navigate the most challenging part of the race without any sort of like external challenge.
But this is where the front end of the race gets very interesting too, because these two contrasting elevation charts here show that when you get to the back half of the race, you're faced with either a set of hills in Boston, that's the terrain you have to conquer, or basically CIM asks you, what can you do on a flat, like really smooth cruise into the finish here? What do you have left? And it asks everybody around sitting there in the pack looking at each other, what do you have left and what kind of fire do you want to throw at each other right now? So I think with that in mind, we'll check in on some of those stories that played out in the past over the last 4 years. And the slide that we have up on screen right now just shows the previous 4 winners on the men's side. And we've broken this down to look at 3 distinct parts of the race. So we have the first 15K, and then the second 15K up to 30K, and then we have the last 12.195K, which is I think like people usually look at the last 10K being the defining part of it, and it is. But this is how we broke it down for this particular look here. But I think you could see 2017 and 2018 were the U.S. champs, the last time that the U.S. Marathon champs were in Sacramento. And I think I remember being there and watching the Tim Ritchie race, and there was Parker Stinson went out at 2:09 pace through 20 miles, I think. So he took off like a bat out of hell, right out of Folsom, and he was on a mission, and I think up to 22 miles, he had a good lead. And I think, like looking at my notes here, even at mile 20, Tim Ritchie was a minute and a half behind first place, and he was sitting in 6th. So you look at his splits here: 5:05 through the first 15K, and then 5:03 through the second 15K, and then looking at that last 12K and that smooth, gentle ride to the finish there, he was able to just ratchet it down to 4:56 and knock out the competition. And he took that win by 32 seconds over second place, I think. And that was at a time in American distance running too, where I think he was the only man besides Galen Rupp with this result to go under 2:12. So a significant performance there. But you can take a look at these other performances. Brogan Austin, 2:12 in 2018, and doing it in a very similar way to Tim Ritchie. 5:06 pace through 30K, and then dropping to 4:57s through that last part. Alicia Barno, and this was.
And if I could jump in too, if I remember, 2018 was pretty similar to 2017 in the sense that you had Matt Lano was kind of the protagonist in that one, where he went out hard, and then there was a huge pack that essentially, moved along together and reeled them in, very similar to, Parker getting after it in 2017.
And I think Lano wasn't overtaken until maybe even the final quarter or half a mile too.
Yeah, it's like definitely within the final mile, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you have that type of approach.
Yeah.
Like you could see here, Brogan Austin sitting in 14th place at 30K, and then wound up in first. So passing.
And I think that group at 30K, there was an enormous group. Like where Brogan was 14th, there was basically like second through, I don't know, 16th or 18th or something. It was some big mass.
Yeah. There we'll have to pull up those results, but yeah, there's that giant mass. There's usually a huge mass of runners, 213 up to, well, I mean, all the way back from there, I guess. It just continues.
Yeah.
But yeah, Alicia Barno in 2019, this was a different, I guess you could say that CJ Albertson was the guy who jumped out to the front. He was the Stinson Lano of that year. And Barno hung back with a few other guys, and Patrick Smythe being one of them, Dennis Chip Cheer, I think, being the other. But 5:07 to 5:06 pace, and then down to 5:04. But there was a pack of 4 of them up until the finish. Barno won by 4 seconds that year, so it was a sprint finish. But then Brendan Gregg last year, a different story, going after the course record, Jerry Lawson's course record of 2:10. Got out 4:58 pace through 30K. And then we just watched from the front vehicle too as he accumulated time second after second, and the record got away from him. But 2:11:21, so the fastest in a very long time. If you're going for a race and if you're going for a win, it makes sense to shut the mind off, stay in your boat for a significant part of the race, and then be patient. And when you get to the final 10K or 12K or whatever it is, then if you have something left, make your move. Is that accurate?
And I would say that's challenging because, Brendan essentially did what, in 2017, 2018, did what Parker tried to do in 2017 and Matt tried to do in 2018.
Right, and he held on.
Yeah. And if you look at 2018, you could probably run that race a couple different times and Matt might have been successful in some of those. And suddenly then kind of the spectrum looks different. So I think I think you could really you could kind of go either way. It's like a, that is a gamble of like, you could sit in that boat and hope that you reel in, that kind of breakaway person, like casting, going and searching for gold, or that person can stay away. And I think either strategy can win. Yeah.
Well, we've seen it. Let's shift over to the women's side too, because we've seen it win on the women's side more often, and there might be a reason for that as well, because this is a mass start, so the women start at the same time as the men. So if you're a man going off on your own in search of gold in them hills out there in Sacramento, then you're out on your own. You're doing all the work yourself. But if you're a woman doing that, here you have some company with some male pacers too. So this graphic we put on the screen here, we could see that Sarah Hall and Emma Bates, they kind of took that same strategy that the Stinson, the Lanos, and Brendan Gregg did, and got out hard from the start. They're in first place here, each of them in first place through 30K, and then held it to the finish. But their pace per mile goes slightly up. So very similar races from each of them, 5:34 to 5:35 through 15K, then 5:39 through the next 15K to 30K, and then up to 5:43 for Sarah Hall and 5:45 for Emma Bates to that finishing position. But they were sitting around, you could see the crazy depth here too, because they're sitting around 100th place overall or 150th place overall. So that just shows how many men are out there too. And also, there are that many women behind them as well, chasing those equal times for them. But looking at this result, Sarah Vaughn's result actually in 2021 is amazing to me. Emma Bates, by the way, that was her marathon debut. Sarah Hall, this was her marathon debut as well in 2021. She got out 5:43s through 15K, dropped it to 5:36s through 30K, and then laid the hammer down 5:28s through that last 12K and took the course record. So 2:26:53 for a marathon debut, just rolling 5:28s for the final 12K.
I would say that's kind of a textbook way of how you set a course record. Is if I were to be advising somebody chasing a time and they thought they were going to be pretty close to it, I would tell them, go out just a little bit slower, go through half. If you're trying to run 2:30, if you're a woman and you're trying to run 2:30, go through half in maybe 75:15 or 75:20. Because you want that, and certainly CIM, I think, rewards that, because we just talked about the terrain differences in the front versus back half. But Yeah, in the marathon, if you can orchestrate the momentum to be on your side in the second half, it pays big time versus the cost of doing it equal and opposite on the other side the cost is much larger. But I think the biggest thing, here looking at the women's strategy, the women's race is unique because, like you said, it's a mass start. So they're in those packs. And when we think about CIM having this incredible depth, the women in these races you can get lost in a sea of men, and it makes the competitive landscape a little bit different. And also allows them to run faster because, one, you could have, from the drafting side, two, but for all the same reasons that we talked about, the OTQ, these boats, the women getting in these masses of men moving along can I think really, really support them in that. But it creates an interesting competitive dynamic in the sense of, a woman who goes, pedal to the metal and is out and gets on, this pace train of guys and, the second place, third place, fourth, but like it can get splintered and they can lose track of each other. And so I think that creates a really interesting competitive dynamic for the women. So I think there's that element that'll be interesting how is kind of managed and the race plays out. So in some ways, I would say it might be easier to be a woman and employ the strategy of basically going after it from the gun and putting yourself out there because you will not be alone and isolated. You'll have the momentum the whole way. Whereas like you think of both Parker and Matt, when they tried to do that in 2017 and 2018, you're out front and you're alone and you get that momentum going the other way harder and harder and harder. Like you can slow down a ton. Whereas, I think a woman using that same strategy might be able to use that energy from those male groups. So I think it creates for the savvy female, I think it creates opportunity to use that to a competitive, play off that. So I think there's that I think is a very defining kind of interesting characteristic of the pointy end of the women's race. And I'm curious though, because I think without knowing or remembering what the depth looked like in those races, I think this year's race, if there's, I don't know if we have someone who's head and shoulders above the rest to do something like that, or if we'll have kind of more parity in the front bit.
Well, perfect segue there with all of this in mind, and what strategies have won in the past. Let's shift our attention to the contenders for this year too, for this year's race, 2022, December 4th. Burnsy, I'm gonna lean on you for this too, because I know you've done some research around here, around each of these contenders here, and I want to hear your thoughts on the men's race. Who are the major players that stick out to you to take the title here?
Yeah, so my thought on this is I think there's probably like 20 guys that could make a case to be in the top 10 for sure. And probably at least 10 or 15 that even could sneak onto the podium. I think there's 5 guys that I'm calling danger men for the win.
Yes.
And you got Brendan Gregg, defending champ. And one of the interesting things, before I move on, that I think the last 2 analyses that we showed of both the women and the men, and I think the women's history brings this up more. Maybe, and we're still on that slide, I'll just hit on this because I think it's a really interesting defining feature of this race, is you do not see very many repeat champions in this race. And not only do you not see very many repeat champions, you often do not see the champion coming back to defend their title. Because one of the unique things about this race is it at the front end can be a springboard a lot of times. This was Sarah Vaughan's marathon debut. And she's not back here to defend the title. We saw a young Sarah Hall and young Emma Bates have, very successful races here and have since gone on, to be on world championship teams. So I think this race is a springboard in many ways. And I mean, similarly for the men, Tim Ritchie, Brogan Austin, they're not back. And I think what happens is you get a good result here and then go, chase something else at the majors, or it kind of gives you that ticket to maybe an appearance fee, comped hotel room, the lavish life of world marathon majors or something.
I hear what you're saying here, and so in a lot of ways this is like stars are born in this race, but because of that it makes it very difficult to pick winners too, because it could be it's a newcomer every time who is really jumping out and then becomes a major player. So this is a race to look at to find that next big star.
Yeah. And I wanted to say all of that because it definitely makes picking the winner hard, because I mean, like you said, like last year was Sarah Vaughan's debut like that. And I mean, I think Brogan in 2018, it was Brogan's debut. There's a lot of wild cards in this and volatility. And so I'll say, when we think about, the men's race this year, we have Brendan Gregg coming back to defend his title. Like that is unique in the history of CIM in this, or maybe not in the history of it, but in the recent history of it.
The hometown boy from Davis, California.
And this is the other features is this is his home course. So that's a compelling, I think he's danger man number one. I think the next one is Noah Droddy. He's had a crazy up and down, saga over the last few years of, dropping some, pretty crazy fast. And then I think at the Marathon Project, he ran 2:09.
Yeah.
Then he had the whole saga of not having a sponsor and things like that. That I thought was pretty interesting. So he was one of those guys that showed a lot of promise early on. And I think if I remember correctly, he even took some big swings at fast marathons. Like I can't remember if it was Chicago or something. So he's been this guy that's been kind of knocking on the door, but also has been willing to put his money where his mouth is, and try and basically make the sacrifices to run fast, which I love. And I think he was even, I don't know if he was working a part-time or full-time job or something like that also while he was chasing it. So I think he's an interesting character that might now, I think he now does have a sponsor, Solomon maybe. This might be kind of the Noah Droddy 2.0. We haven't heard from him in a while. So he's definitely another danger man. Then Matt Lano is back, which he was the guy who could smell the victory in 2018 and was so close and had it taken away. And so I think he's a super, super interesting one as well. And then the other guy that's quite curious is Tyler Pennell, with the On team, one of the On teams. I've actually seen him and his group out here running in Colorado Springs. They've done camps here before. But he's interesting because he's definitely got the chops to run a pretty fast marathon. I think
he ran 2:12 in Atlanta.
Okay, so that was it. And I think he might have got, was he fifth in that race or did I get that wrong? But he definitely he put himself in it. And I thought it was the 2016 trials where he like led it for a chunk when it was slow. And then blew up in the last bit. But Yeah, he can race the marathon well, and I think his best is one of those things that doesn't represent how good he might be able to be. Um, yeah, and so I think he's definitely a contender. And then the other one that's the big question mark is the debutante Folsom Selassie.
Yes.
Um, he's the question mark, and I think this is definitely a race where a debutante can take it all. And he's interesting because he's got some some wicked track times, which I would actually say in some cases I would use that to predict I don't want to say less success, but less probability of success, because I think at some point the optimizations, physiologically and mechanically that you make to be exceptional on the track in the 5K, 10K, come at the cost of the things that allow you to be successful over 42K, 42.2K. But he's one that seems to have more, his performances seem to be more impressive the further and further he goes. From when he was in college, from 5K to 10K to now, I think he's run right around 61 minutes for a half.
Yeah. As a debutante, well, as Folsom Selassie specifically, would you advise him to go out the Stinson style or the Emma Bates style? Or would you advise him to go more of a Brogan Austin style?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And this is one that's interesting with a marathon too, because and this was actually happened for me and when I ran a debut 100K, but I always say you only get to debut once. And in some ways, the smartest thing is to do it conservatively and build momentum for your future ones. But the one advantage that you have is your body and mind does not know what's coming. So you can run without a governor. Every race that you run after your debut, you have a governor. And that can sometimes work to your advantage. But you get drunk on magic in your first one if you're feeling good. And so that can go really wrong sometimes. And a lot of times, it can, you can go backwards, but yeah, it definitely could be one that, he could, I think if he were to take the Matt Lano or Parker Stinson strategy, I suspect he would go backwards towards the end, when you're a debutante. But the trick is, maybe if you can do it and, give yourself enough of a buffer that you can crash the plane into the finish line first.
It's a risky proposition.
Yeah. So I don't know. So to your question of would I advise him? I would absolutely probably advise him to take the Brogan Austin route and sit in a pack because, again, when you debut, I think it can be tempting. Everything that I said of the course tempting you to run fast, I think that can happen and you could have a great result. But I think if you play the flip side, where you have all of this energy and fitness and ability to run a really good race on your debut, if you bottle that up for the first 30K and then you still have it at 30K, then you can ride the fun of being able to race the last chunk of the marathon.
Right.
And I think the people who go on to have really successful marathon careers, having a debut like that, where you are a little conservative at the start and then can actually race the last chunk of it, really sets you up for great races in the future, but also allows you to use all of your faculties in the back half of that race. So I think I would like his chances of if he sat in and was patient and raced the last chunk. And it's interesting because I think he runs for the NAZ Elite group, I believe.
Yeah, just joined back up.
Yeah, so he's got guidance, I think whether that plays out on race day or not.
It's a solid
but
marathon crew to be a part of. There's a lot
yeah,
of
and so
experience there.
I think hopefully having elder statesmen to maybe guide execution be might help him on that front. But looking at those 5 guys that I just talked about, like any one of them like could be the guy to take it out hard, because one, Matt Lano has been that guy. Brendan Gregg has been that guy. Tyler Pennell has been that guy in other race. And I think Drotty has even, gone and taken swings in marathons, a little bigger than what he, taking big swings. I can't remember what race it was that he did. I think it was Chicago maybe. But all of those guys are guys that can like have gone out and got after races, and they could be looking at the field thinking like, that can be my way to win. So there's the other part of me that thinks, do you get a pack of those guys like running fast from the start? Like, do they get out at 209 pace and cruise? And, Noah, having run 209, like he could do that and not blow up. I actually think any of those guys could do that and not blow up. So you could potentially have a pod of guys racing that.
Well, let's take a look at your top women's contenders, and then we'll come back and finish it off with a list of your top 10, because we're gonna have you make a pick of who's gonna take this one. Your educated guess. But before we do that, give us your top women contenders here.
Okay, so I would say our danger women in this group is you definitely have, I think, a couple at the top. You have Paige Stoner, I think, is an interesting character here. I think she ran 2:28 at the Marathon Project, and then ran 70 minutes this year and a half. So I really like her. I think she's got the hot hand right now, in the sense of like putting up, she put up a good marathon time, but I think this year already has a good half. But she, I think, and I wish I knew the answer to this, but I believe she was a Syracuse alum. And so there's a special place in my heart. I lived there for a summer and ran with those guys and worked in a research lab. So love the orange, Syracuse orange. But anyways, she, I believe, was with Chris Fox's group, that the Reebok Boston, that the paradoxical Reebok Boston track club based in Charlottesville, Virginia.
Yeah.
But the reason I say that is like Chris Fox is, he's an exceptional coach. And he knows how to produce good racers, but good marathon runners as well. And he also himself has a really interesting history in the marathon as a competitive racer, where I think he ran his best. I'd have to go back and look at what our all-time lists are, but he ran pretty fast. But he didn't do it until he was like 38 or something like that, and had just been chipping away for years and years and years. But he's a smart dude, and I think prepares marathoners well. I don't know if I think that group might have since disbanded, or I don't know what its current status is, but anyways, if she's had that guidance for a while, I'd always bet on a Coach Fox runner. Bria Wetch also, I think, dipped under 2:30 at the Marathon Project, but has also similarly run 70 minutes this year. And so I think she's also like in a similar boat, where like kind of riding hot and running well. She's based here in Colorado, and so there's always part of me that, like, from the physiologist, thinking like, coming down from altitude, like I like that potential boost.
There's a slew of Flagstaff athletes here too.
Yes, and so I think that's the other. I mean, I think the women's race is almost like there's an element of like Boulder versus Flagstaff going on, like sub competition. Because I thought is Bria based out of Boulder or not? I don't know. I'd get that wrong. But yeah, then we have a couple Flagstaffians. Mixture of Hoka, run Flagstaff. You have Julia Griffey with the Hoka NAZ group, and then Katya Goldring. And I think Katya has run this race several times as well, in the top 10.
She's run 2:30 at CIM.
Yeah, so she's definitely like I said, a danger woman who's had the demonstrated success. And then I think there are two other danger women that I've pegged that are almost like opposites. But you have Diane Nakuri, who ran she ran 227 pre-super shoe era in 2015. But like I don't know her recent results. Do you know is there much much been going on that front?
She's run 241 this year in Chicago.
241 in Chicago?
Yeah.
Okay. And that's pretty recent.
And 113 in Monterey recently too.
What was it? 113?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think she's one that has the history of running well, and that's, I mean, I think the Chicago, having run in Chicago is kind of an interesting, it depends on how that's managed through her buildup, and I'm always one to hedge against runners that come in with like really good performances from a while ago that haven't quite gotten close to. I think, I think just looking at trajectories, she's certainly one that's been there, but I don't know as I'd say the probability is high. But the other one that's the flip side of that is our debutante of interest on the women's side, and that's Lauren Hurley.
Given the history of debutantes in this race, I'm very interested in.
I think Hurley is one of the most compelling characters here because she runs 69 minutes this year.
She did, but it recently came out that she ran that in Indianapolis in terrible weather. But I think the course was slightly short. So
okay.
I don't think it was significant.
I didn't follow on that.
Yeah.
But and I think so. I don't know. Maybe bad weather versus short course like kind of evens out. So if we say she's in roughly that shape, she's also run pretty fast on like 5 and 10K on the track. And again, this is one of those cases where a lot of times if I think of a track runner who's very good at 5K or very good at 10K moving up, I always raise my eyebrows. But when I look at somebody who is, because I guess for your viewers, listeners, to my knowledge, I don't know if she ran in college or not, but she's relatively new runner. I think she's coming from triathlon.
Yeah. And very tough. Like I called her race at the 10, and she ran the second heat of the 10. So not the Elise Cranny 30-14, but she won that second heat of the 10 doing the work by herself. And I think that was 31-40 something. So
that, like doing the work by yourself in a 10K on the track, that's a pretty marathon specific skill. And so to kind of like grind out a race like that. And then she also, I think earlier this year, if I remember correctly, had something where there was some like large prize offering for like the fastest
Pittsburgh
5K in Pittsburgh. Yeah.
Yeah.
And she and one of her like teammates got after it, and didn't she run like 15-15 or something like that?
I think in the 15 teens, yeah, and took 20 grand from it. Yeah.
Which is like, I mean, props to her for that, like seeing that opportunity and going for it. That's like that might that probably netted her more than, success at CIM would.
It is 20 grand for the win for US Marathon Champs. So,
but also in the threat of CIM being a launch pad, like net present value of a CIM victory. Let's do that calculation.
oh man,
Sarah Hall, Emma Bates. What do you think that, the CIM victory is worth for them? Probably quite a bit more than whatever the that initial check on race day is.
Sure.
But also, CIM, we don't do this for one of the beautiful things about this is these are people doing this for the passion. Yeah, of course you want the people prize money, but I think for a lot of these runners and racers, you're doing this because you want to run and win. You want to win a marathon.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the beautiful things about it too. So I think Lauren, similar to Folsom, I think is kind of that. What I was going to say too is I think she's, when you come into running and have a background endurance sport, I then on the flip side actually like her prospects as she gets longer and longer in the sense of because she's, I don't know how old she is, but I think she's mid-30s, a mom, but has this background. I like that strength, and I like the upside of the marathon for her. So I think she's definitely the wild card danger woman.
Well, those are your danger men and women.